Good morning and welcome to China's Nuclear Modernization, Motivations, and Regional Implications. My name is Caitlin Talmadge. I am an associate professor here in the Security Studies program at Georgetown University, and I am delighted to be moderating this discussion this morning, co-sponsored by the Walsh School of Foreign Service Asian Studies program and the Initiative for U.S.-China Dialogue on Global Issues here at Georgetown. We want to thank them for convening this conversation. So unless you've been living under a rock lately, you know that there is a lot going on with respect to China's nuclear developments. China's arsenal appears to be growing both qualitatively and quantitatively. And it's been grabbing quite a few headlines, whether it is the apparent discovery of new nuclear silo fields this summer, or reports just last week that China tested a new system that could potentially be used to evade US missile defenses. What we'd like to do this morning is try to get beyond these headlines and talk in more depth to delve into what China is doing, why it's doing what it's doing with its nuclear arsenal, and what Chinese nuclear developments mean for the United States and other countries in the region and around the world. To do that, we have with us three absolutely world-class experts, people who frankly have forgotten more about Chinese nuclear forces than most of us will ever know, and three people from whom I personally always learn a lot about these topics. And so we're thrilled to have them. I'm going to introduce each of them briefly, and then I will pose a few starting questions to each of them to delve into these issues surrounding China's nuclear forces. We'll hear their responses to get us started, and then we will turn to a moderated Q&A. So if you're in the audience and you have questions about these issues, please start thinking about those, get those ready for the chat, because after a few questions to get things started, we will turn to you and hopefully have more interaction and engagement from those of you in the audience. So without further ado, let me briefly introduce our three distinguished panelists this morning. First, we have with us Dr. Hans Christensen, who is director of the Nuclear Information Project at the Federation of American Scientists here in Washington, D.C. He is responsible for researching and documenting the status and operations of nuclear forces of the 9 nuclear-armed states. And in particular, he's co-author of the bi-monthly FAS Nuclear Notebook column in the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists and the World Nuclear Forces Overview in the SIP Yearbook. And if you are not familiar with these resources, I highly, highly recommend them. I assign both of them in my classes every year. These are go-to sources of information about nuclear issues, particularly China's nuclear arsenal. Previously, Christensen was a consultant to the nuclear program at the National Resources Defense Council, a program officer at the Nautilus Institute, and he's also been a special advisor to the Danish Minister of Defense. Our second panelist is Dr. Fiona Cunningham. She is an assistant professor of political science at the University of Pennsylvania. Her research interests lie at the intersection of technology and conflict, with an empirical focus on China. She has published widely on China's nuclear strategy, US-China strategic stability, and escalation dynamics in the nuclear, cyber, and maritime domains. And in particular, I recommend to you her articles in international security and security studies if you want to learn more about these issues. Currently, she's also writing a book which explains how and why China threatens to use space weapons, cyber attacks, and conventional missiles as substitutes for nuclear threats in the post-Cold War era. And in addition, she is a non-resident scholar in the nuclear policy program at Carnegie, where she was also a Stanton Fellow last year. Finally, our third panelist is Dr. Tong Shao, who is a senior fellow in the nuclear policy program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He is joining us from Beijing this morning. Thank you. And he's also a virtual visiting research fellow at the Cooperative Monitoring Center at Sandia National Laboratories. He serves on the board of directors of the Asia Pacific Leadership Network for Nuclear Nonproliferation and Disarmament, and on the advisory board of the Missile Dialogue Initiative. Zhao is also an associate editor of Science and Global Security, which is a great journal on these issues if you haven't checked it out. And you should also check out his writings on the Carnegie site. And he's a member of the International Panel on Fissile Materials. So with our introductions made, what I would like to do to kick off the discussion is pose an opening question to try to urge our panelists to help us separate the wheat from the chaff a little bit in all of the news about China's nuclear arsenal recently. And in particular, to help us understand what are the important developments and what do they mean. So the question I'd like to pose is, what do each of you see as the most important recent developments in China's nuclear forces? And just as important, what do you think is driving Chinese nuclear decision-making in these areas? And we'll just ask our panelists to discuss this in alphabetical order. I will turn first to Fiona, and then we will go from there. So Fiona, do you want to take a crack at it?
Okay, so thank you so much for the introduction, Caitlin. I'm really excited for this discussion too. So I think there are sort of three main headline things that China's recent nuclear modernization has indicated. It's building a bigger nuclear arsenal with a greater diversity of delivery systems, and it's keeping that potentially at a higher level of readiness. So I'll point to sort of 5 things that suggest those changes or that sort of flesh them out. A quantitative increase in its intercontinental ballistic missile forces, a return to silo basing, which reverses the course of a lot of China's post-Cold War modernization that trended towards having more mobile systems that were more survivable and harder for an adversary to find. A greater diversity, survivability, and accuracy in its theater range forces that includes both its DF-26, which is a truly kind of dual-capable intermediate range missile, as well as sea and a nascent air leg to its nuclear arsenal, which I'd add are not particularly survivable the further they travel from China's immediate periphery. Finally, I'd note that it is looking at higher readiness of parts of the force that mean China would be able to launch nuclear weapons more quickly and building out an early warning system that could enable it to shift to a launch under attack posture in the future. And obviously, just in the last week, we've seen testing of novel delivery systems, or at least the reporting of that. So I think that there are a number of drivers which influence different components of China's nuclear modernization. So I'll point to a couple of them. I think first, even if we just expect China's long-standing nuclear posture of assured retaliation to be continuing, you'd still see modernization. So to maintain a credible nuclear retaliatory capability, given some of the investments and technological advancements the United States has made in recent years that could allow it to both preemptively destroy Chinese nuclear capabilities, as well as capture some of China's retaliation using missile defenses. China indicated, a number of years ago that it would build more intercontinental range ballistic missiles and also hedge with sea-based and glide vehicles. Many of the capabilities I think we're seeing coming online in the past 2 to 3 years are a result of some of these much earlier decisions that go back 5 to 10 years. And a more diverse set of delivery systems, I think, helps China to hedge against failures of other systems. So if there's a problem with its mobile land-based forces, perhaps silo-based forces are going to help it to have a more secure retaliatory capability. But I think there are also some changes that are afoot in how China is thinking about its nuclear forces. First, I think China's assessment of how much damage is going to be enough to deter the United States is changing and is increasing. In light of the deteriorating political relationship, a few nuclear weapons which might have been sufficient 10 years ago is no longer enough today. The other thing that I think is changing is that China is perhaps less concerned about getting into an arms race than it was 5 years ago. In the past, Chinese analysts had suggested they were quite reluctant to be baited into an arms race of the kind they believed that bankrupted the Soviet Union and contributed to its collapse. I think there are signs that reluctance might be shifting. Finally, I think the organizational inputs into nuclear strategy in China have shifted. The military, which has historically been kept out of this process, likely has more influence. Again, these are tricky things to tell from the outside. And I would note that the People's Liberation Army may be less attuned to some of the misperceptions, the inadvertent nuclear escalation risks, and other risks of instability that other actors within China, in particular in its nuclear labs, may be more attuned to. And I'll end just by saying that I'm not sure that Xi Jinping shares past leadership beliefs of the limited utility of nuclear weapons as instruments of political influence or even potentially war fighting. We're just not entirely clear what his thoughts are on these capabilities, and this has been a major constraint on China's forces in the past. So I'll stop there and listen to what my co-panelists have to add.
Great, thank you so much. Getting us started off with plenty to discuss there. We've already got a couple questions in the Q&A, so if you have more, feel free to bring them in. I want to turn now to Hans. Do you want to jump in and tell us your take on this question of the important developments in China's arsenal and what's driving them?
Yes, certainly. Thanks very much for having me here. It's a great panel, very timely, and we need to dive more into these issues about what's the underlying dynamic here, rather than fixate on numbers and sort of worst case scenarios. And it's hard to add to what Fiona said, of course, a very broad and comprehensive, and I think fair assessment of what is going on. What has caught my eye, of course, is also the political decision that it's necessary to increase the arsenal. Of course, China has traditionally adhered very strongly and spoken repeatedly internationally about the importance of having a minimum deterrent. Now, any country, no matter how many nuclear weapons they have, will always say that what they have is a minimum deterrent because it's exactly what they need, not more. So in that sense, China is probably not much different. But compared to what its posture has been in the past, we're obviously seeing a very significant development here, both with the growth of its mobilized CBMs, but also certainly with its silo-based, its addition of an air leg, the increase of capabilities in the accuracy and the performance of these systems, and also this mingling of conventional and nuclear, which I think is a really interesting and potentially troublesome element of the Chinese posture. The fact, I would also mention MIRV, the multiple warheads on the system, the introduction of that. We've seen some systems being developed and apparently motivated by an interest in trying to overcome effects of US ballistic missile defense systems. We will see how much of the multiple warhead configuration will go on these new silos that are being built, and how much of that capability will go on the submarines in the future as well. The air leg for me is interesting, not just because it's a third leg to the triad, but also because of what they might put on that air leg, and how they think about what the role of an air leg should be. You know, obviously, with their capability as of now, it's mainly a regional capability. So it speaks, at least in my mind, to thinking about how their nuclear posture will function in an area, you know, in the periphery, so to speak. That can go far out into the Pacific, of course. Nonetheless, but we'll also see if it leads to programs to develop, you know, air-launched cruise missiles, for that matter, in the future. We haven't seen that. There have been some hiccups here and there about it, but not much. And so we'll see what they do with that. And then, of course, what's the point of putting, you know, so many solid fuel ICBMs or whatever they're going to put in there into the silos? Is this an interest in having a posture that can react quicker? Is it an interest in having a posture that can potentially develop into some kind of launch on warning with the appropriate warning systems in place? And what does that mean? We hear, of course, that their modernization, including the silos, is being sort of pitched worst case, instinctively, by U.S. military commentators, that it somehow calls into question their no first use policy. I don't necessarily see that. I can imagine China could easily do its current nuclear posture and still could retain a no first use policy. Question is, does that matter much in a real world situation? And in the past, also, I think one of the benefits of China's no first use policy has been that it apparently has put some sort of a damper on the ambitions of the capabilities. What is it that the military is supposed to plan for? If they're now moving to a posture that is much more capable and much more diverse, does that mean that some of those constraints are disappearing? And of course, dual capable, like I mentioned, I think are really tricky because of the way they interject with the crisis stability issues, the potential for misunderstandings and overreactions in intense escalation scenarios. And what's driving it, of course, I think at the core is to preserve retaliatory strike capabilities. They're really concerned, or apparently really concerned, that the US can, and of course also the other nuclear powers that they plan against, can perhaps, if not, eradicate their retaliatory capability, but certainly, create doubts about its effectiveness. I also think there is a great deal of national prestige with the Xi leadership, that this is, he's quite clearly set the pace and the objectives of what China's supposed to be. And it seems that, larger nuclear forces is a natural element of that national prestige, of a greater military power and capability in the future. And then, of course, there's the tricky issue also. With these regional systems, is there a drive toward development of more flexible options in their response, in their counterattack scenarios? Rather than, in the traditional old way, it was sort of, well, we have the nukes here. If you do something stupid and everything comes to the final point here, we will do this retaliation. But of course, an all-out retaliation may not be very credible or even very useful. So are we seeing, more flexible options, sort of step-by-step ladder of building up the response in a crisis and essentially trying to de-escalate a crisis in the future? Are those kind of the drivers we're also seeing? So these are some of my thoughts. I'll just leave it here, and we can see, what comes out of the questions and the other comments.
Great, thank you so much for your insights on that. I think you raise a number of new points and also echo some of the themes that Fiona brought up, which I hope we'll talk a little bit more about as we go on, related to crisis stability, possible changes in China's nuclear forces. But first, let's go to Tong and hear his main thoughts on what the key developments really are and what's driving Chinese nuclear decision-making. Over to you.
Oh, thank you. I very much agree that many of China's new nuclear modernization programs appear to be driven by China's perceived threat about US missile defense. But I actually think one of the programs are particularly significant, which is the new silos, a large number of new silos. The new silos show that China is not only concerned about missile defense, because the best tactical advantage of a large number of silos is to undermine the effectiveness of a nuclear preemptive strike on China, especially if you think China is doing the shell game thing, meaning to deploy a small number of real missiles in a large number of silos. That just highlights the Chinese concern about preemptive strike. And why does China start to worry about preemptive strike, which is the point I think I will talk about later. But it shows that it's not just about missile defense. The silo development also shows that China is willing to really utilize its perceived advantage in its infrastructure construction capacity, meaning that in the future, I think China is willing to more directly turning its growing economic power into its military power. A second development I think is significant is the fact that China appears to be experimenting with exotic nuclear delivery technologies. FOBs, the orbital hypersonic weapon system, is making international experts scratch their heads and trying to understand what's the specific military rationale behind that very convoluted way to deliver a nuclear warhead to the US homeland. I think what may be likely to be happening is that in China, the top political leadership started to be convinced that China needs a bigger nuclear capability in general. And with that top level political interest, the nuclear establishment at the bureaucratic level, they are blessed with resources. Therefore, they have the capacity to experiment with whatever new technologies they are interested in. It's another way to say that the nuclear establishment, the operational level actors, they are pleased with the new funding and resources, and there is really no stakeholder that is pushing back against the renewed interest in nuclear capability. There is no internal checks and balances. There is no Chinese expert, at least in the public domain, arguing about, questioning, asking questions such as, how much is enough? How much counter missile defense technologies and capabilities would be sufficient for China to secure a second strike capability? If no one is asking those basic questions, and when the nuclear establishment is blessed with funding and resources, I think a likely outcome is to develop overkill capability. So even if China's goal is purely driven by self-defensive purposes, such as to strengthen its second strike capability, the result could be an overkill. And that could drive further anxiety in the United States, make the United States suspect what's the real Chinese intention. Is China moving towards a more aggressive and offensive nuclear posture, and therefore risk a negative action-reaction cycle? And last quick point I want to make is, again, I think China's nuclear buildup is indeed a response to a heightened threat perception. But that threat perception is not necessarily caused so much by technical level factors like missile defense. I think it's more caused by political level issues, especially the rising ideological confrontation between US and China. Since many international observers have argued that since 2008, China has gradually reversed its liberalization process on its economic and political policies. And the new Chinese paramount leader appears to really reject Western values and Western political system, Western ideology. And we see US pressuring China more increasingly strongly on issues of human rights, Xinjiang, Hong Kong, so-called domestic suppression, democracy, rule of law, etc. It's those, so American efforts to basically uphold its core principles and values starts to be viewed by China as the most threatening measures that aim to destabilize Chinese political system and to threaten China's political regime. So I think out of that concern, Chinese political leaders believe they need a much greater military capability in general and a nuclear capacity in particular to force the United States to accept a mutual vulnerability relationship with China, to accept peaceful existence, a peaceful coexistence with China under China's current political system. So in other words, the nuclear buildup may be a solution to the perceived and growing political disagreements between the two powers.
Thank you very much for those comments. And I really like how you broaden the discussion a little bit to think about what the nuclear relationship means in the context of the overall political relationship, because I agree with you. I think the two are very interconnected, and the nuclear dynamics are nested in these broader deteriorating political dynamics. And that actually relates to the next question that I wanted to pose to all three of you. And it's also a question that's come up already in the chat, which has to do with whether we're seeing the emergence of an arms race between the United States and China, and whether we should think about what's going on between the US and China as being stabilizing or destabilizing. Because standard nuclear theory, and you kind of hinted at this at the end of your remarks, Tong, is that when two states have a condition of mutual vulnerability and they each have secure second strike forces, that should make deterrence really strong and lead to peace and stability. And what I'm hearing from all three of you in your discussions of things like crisis stability, escalation risks, nuclear conventional entanglement, a deteriorating political relationship between the US and China, regional tensions, is perhaps that China's nuclear developments are not leading to stability. And so I guess my question is, do we have an arms race going on here? Why or why not? And what are the implications of those developments for the United States? So, is this an incipient arms race that the United States can do something to tamp down, or how do you read these dynamics? So, if anyone wants to go first, you can raise your hand, or I can just call on you in the same order. Why don't we just go back in the same order again? We'll go to Fiona, and then Hans, and then to Tom.
So I think this is a fantastic question, and it's a really, really tricky one. I guess that I would draw out both political as well as military implications. So I'll get to the arms race, but I think the first thing I want to just note is that I think the political implications of China's nuclear buildup are just as important as the military implications for analysts in the United States, but also in allied capitals around the Indo-Pacific and NATO as well. And I think politically, Chinese nuclear modernization is sort of read as a confirmation of China's aggressive intentions, perhaps, rather than a real desire to use nuclear weapons first, as some of its new capabilities could enable. So I'll just unpack that a little bit. I think in the past, China lacked some of the nuclear capabilities and operational practices that would allow it to credibly threaten nuclear first use in a conflict, as Hans sort of pointed to in his remarks, and it's gained some of those through nuclear modernization, such as its more accurate theater capabilities, high readiness, larger numbers. And, I don't think US analysts were ever that willing to take China's no first use policy at its word, but previously its threats wouldn't have been very credible because it lacked the capabilities to back them. So just pointing to that sort of political piece first. But I think on the question of whether the United States and China are entering into an arms race, these kinds of things depend very much on how the United States reacts, and it depends upon what the drivers are within China. And I think some of the things that Tom pointed to with what is kind of bureaucratically driving these questions in China are really important to understand and unpack. But I note that I don't think China's nuclear modernization is giving it a capability to preemptively strike the US nuclear arsenal. And that was a really important generator of competition during the Cold War. But what it does do is to limit the effectiveness of US attempts to preemptively strike the Chinese arsenal and then mop up its retaliatory strikes with missile defense. So it's thinning the US damage limitation capability, to put it sort of in technical terms. And so how should the United States sort of think about this? Well, I don't think that the US arsenal is currently unable to carry out its missions to deter not just China, but also Russia and North Korea. That's one of the other interesting consequences of the nuclear multipolar sort of situation the US finds itself in. But a continued Chinese buildup could bring about that situation in the future. And I think whether it brings about an arms race is really going to depend upon how the United States thinks, what it thinks that it needs if it is fighting more than one of these nuclear countries in a nuclear war simultaneously or in close succession, and whether it wants to be able to limit damage against these nuclear adversaries if such a terrible scenario occurred. So a lot of it has to do with, I think, how the US thinks about its force requirements going forward. I might pause here for a moment, and hopefully we'll come back to some of the questions about implications for conventional conflicts and stay on this sort of arms race piece for the time being.
Sure thing, we will do that. Thank you for that basket of sunshine. I'm glad you paused for a moment. I'll turn now to Hans for your thoughts on this issue.
Yeah, obviously a key question. We hear some of the same questions in the relations between the United States and Russia, of course. Are we in a nuclear arms race and things like that? And I think it's an unfortunate kind of grab bag terminology, reaching back to the Cold War type of relationship, in my view, Because of course, we're not in an arms race, meaning racing to build the most nuclear weapons. That is not at all what is going on. I would say we're more in a technological and political arms race, if you could say that, where the forces are being developed and improved and diversified out of fear of being inadequate or overwhelming first strike fear, or whatever the drivers are. And I've add to that a dose of national prestige interests, of course. But definitely a technological arms race, no doubt about it. I mean, this is just not, of course, not just in nuclear, but also in conventional and even in non-kinetic capabilities. I mean, we've even seen, we look at the language, look at the rhetoric, look at the strategy documents that are being put out. We're officially in great power competition. The key is competition. That's what it's about. So we're competing on all these levels, and that's what we do, and that's how agencies translate this guidance. But I think also at this stage we're still we're in a it's testing out the water, so to speak, evolution of this relationship, because if you remember during the Cold War with the Soviets, it was much similar in terms of the dynamics. Someone will do something, the other one will react to it. We have theories about crisis stability, theories about escalation control, and what will should we have the diversity of forces? Do we need to match them? All this kind of stuff is in a way playing out again in this relationship, and it has to mature. And it is possible, of course, that down the line out of it will come political figures on both sides that'll begin to say, we're not really improving our national security or that of the region by continuing this competition. And so maybe there are other things we have to think about. And we're beginning to hear it from some corners, including in China, as a matter of fact, that some of the more sort of offensive, threatening, worrisome capabilities they're interested to talk about. But it's not an official presentation. We're hearing in the United States, of course, we're sort of hearing, well, China should be part of the arms control process, and we need to make that happen. And how do we make that happen? Nobody knows. And as far as I know, we haven't even heard U.S. officials articulate what we're willing to offer the Chinese in response for something that isn't in our interest. And so there are all these different elements of this race or this dynamic that are playing out now that are not settled at all. And well, we'll see where it ends.
Great, thank you. And I like how you encourage us to think about some of the historical comparisons here too. Like what does it actually mean to be in an arms race? Is this different from what we saw with the Soviets? I want to turn out to Tong and get your thoughts. And I'd be particularly interested, Tong, if you have any further insight to add on this last issue that Hans mentioned about kind of how the debate is evolving, in at least some quarters in China, if there's kind of domestic political criticism or pushback against what seems to be an arms racy dynamic emerging. So any particular thoughts on the perspective from where you're sitting this morning would be extra appreciated, in addition to addressing the larger question.
Well, unfortunately, not much internal discussion or debate in the unclassified domain at all. The issue of reported new missile silos and reported orbital hypersonic missile testing is not discussed by nuclear and arms control experts as if they do not exist. I think the increasing emphasis on security, on protecting national secrets is really making people feel that even discussion among colleagues about these issues would be too sensitive. So maybe there is discussion happening at the classified level, but nothing. So that's, I think, could be very concerning, because even the nuclear experts, they appear to now know what is going on regarding Chinese own development. And they have to basically rely on foreign open source research to understand what China is doing. And because of the Chinese denial of the developments, it really make them even harder to even acknowledge and debate these developments. Regarding the implications of Chinese nuclear developments for US and its allies, I think it depends on Chinese specific military objectives. I think there may be two military objectives from an analytical perspective. One is China wants to further assure its nuclear second strike capability because of the perceived higher strategic threats and hostility from the United States. China may believe that its existing nuclear deterrence is not assured enough. So to be, to make it 100% absolutely assured is beneficial for China. And that certainly has implications for conventional level military stability, given the stability-instability paradox. I think, especially as China currently believes that all the issues regarding its claimed territories in South China Sea, in East China Sea, its efforts to achieve national unification with Taiwan are purely China's legitimate core national interests, that no one should have a say in it except China itself. So certainly, I think there will be thinking in other countries about whether an absolutely assured nuclear, mutual nuclear vulnerability relationship between US and China would affect conventional level military stability. I think a second Chinese potential military objective is to develop escalation control capacity, just as Hans mentioned. It makes sense for China after China, achieved a basic massive retaliation capability. It would, makes every sense for China to move on to consider more sophisticated nuclear scenarios. And there is a big space between secure second strike and nuclear first strike. And in that space, I think China is trying to develop escalation control capacities at various rungs of the potential escalation ladder. So, I think the development of regional missile capabilities would give China the capacity to respond in a symmetrical or proportional way if the US launches a limited theater range nuclear attack on China, even using low yield nuclear weapons. So China doesn't have to immediately jump to an all-out nuclear retaliation. And as the escalation moves up, I think China worries that if the US starts to use ICBMs or SLBMs to target Chinese key military sites on Chinese territory, then China should have the capacity to also use nuclear weapons to hold key military targets in the United States under threat. And China's increasing missile accuracy is giving China that capacity to conduct a symmetrical counterforce strike in order to achieve escalation control. I think the implication is when both countries are competing to achieve escalation control, I think it is the risk of arms race is just much greater. And a third implication, if I may, is when the Chinese attention is mostly about how to further develop the capability, both the qualitative and quantitative improvement of the capability, naturally there will be less attention paid to issues like crisis instability, how the new technologies might affect escalation or might affect inadvertent escalation. We talk about the Chinese entanglement between nuclear and conventional system, the dual-capable DF-26 missiles. Also, the reported Chinese efforts to put some portion of its nuclear forces on higher alert on a rotational basis, even during peacetime, and reported Chinese interest in acquiring early warning and launch under attack capabilities. I think those have huge implications for crisis stability in the future.
Thank you very much for those remarks. I think you make a useful connection between the nuclear and the conventional, and I'm actually hearing some similar themes, I think, from what all three of you are saying, in regards to both the first question and the second question, which is, if I can summarize, China does not want to be the victim of a first strike. It also wants to avoid being subject to limited nuclear coercion in a conventional war or a crisis, which partly for some of the reasons that you've all outlined seems perhaps more likely today than it did 5 or 10 years ago for a variety of reasons. You can imagine a variety of scenarios. And so China, in order to avoid those problems, is moving toward more diversified nuclear forces, and those may include even theater nuclear forces that can be used in a more limited way. So a different sort of nuclear capability maybe than we've seen in the past. So I think that leads naturally to the last question that I want to pose before we go to the Q&A, which is, how do you think the United States should respond to these developments? We've heard several mentions of arms control, and this is something I know Tong has thought about quite a bit in particular, but is arms control a possibility on these issues? What would be the point of it? What would it look like? How should the United States pursue it? Do you think the United States should pursue it? And then I also want to ask you, distinct from the question of what you think the United States and perhaps its allies should do in response to some of the developments that we've talked about, I want to ask you what you think they will do, because I think there might be some daylight there. So if you could talk a little bit about those policy implications and where you see the policy debate going, that would be really helpful. And then we'll turn to some of the Q&A. So I'll go again to Fiona.
So I think these are, again, really, really challenging and really difficult sort of issues. I'm going to take a step back from the arms control question in particular, because I actually think there's another really important thing that the US and its allies should do in dealing with Chinese nuclear modernization and China's, just in general, the challenges they face in the region, which is to keep investing in conventional capabilities. I think this is what really deters China. It's also what really reassures allies, because they're more usable regardless of what we are seeing with a lot more thinking about what a nuclear conflict would look like. And I think the reason that this is important to sort of emphasize in the context of this discussion is that any nuclear arms race is coming at an opportunity cost for investing in conventional capabilities, at least for the United States. And so when it goes into thinking about, do we want arms control? What are appropriate force limits? Thinking about what the trade-offs might be in a budgetary sense for nuclear capabilities and conventional investments is really important. And I would definitely, if I had to put my money on one of these two capabilities, I would put it on conventional. Second, I think, I'm going to give some sort of modest suggestions for what the US and its allies should do, because I think arms control is an over-the-horizon kind of prospect, but I think there's some preparatory work the US and its allies should do. One of those is to work out how big or sophisticated China's nuclear arsenal is going to need to get before the US can no longer fulfill all of its nuclear missions to deter China, Russia, North Korea, and extend credible nuclear guarantees to its allies under the present sort of New START levels. So working out what you need and then work back from that particular point and make that clear to both China and Russia that I think once you get over that threshold, arms racing is going to become much more difficult to deal with because it becomes a three-way problem in the truest sense of the word rather than a bilateral problem. And I think even for China, avoiding that kind of a situation should be a top priority. I think laying the groundwork for any future kind of discussion or arms control is something that the United States should be doing, basically just trying to keep talking to China about nuclear weapons, no matter how bad the relationship gets. I think right now there's been a real breakdown in that sort of level of discussion. And so even really simple things like working out from China right now, what things could go into the US's nuclear posture review that would dampen, leave unchanged, or accelerate a buildup in its nuclear weapons. So, very simple things, getting an understanding of the domestic dynamic and what's driving Chinese motivations, as Tong has suggested, which will help the US work out if it does want to put limits on future nuclear capabilities, what incentives need to be shifted for China in that sort of manner. And then the last thing I'd sort of point out, and just sort of conceptually drawing up ideas for arms control, is to explore asymmetric bargains, because one of the things we haven't really talked about too much in the discussion just yet is that the drivers of Chinese nuclear modernization and US nuclear modernization are not just about nuclear weapons. They're about conventional long-range strike. They're about threats to nuclear command and control capabilities coming from the cyber and electronic domains. They're about the integrity of space warning capabilities and the threats to them through anti-satellite capabilities. So the ring needs to be drawn a little bit more broader than just looking at nuclear arms control, but to think about what other capabilities may need to be discussed or limited in order to really put a damper on those arms race kind of dynamics we've been discussing. So one of the things I would suggest is, even if they seem completely impossible, discussing what kinds of asymmetric bargains you would need. So, for example, with limits on missile defense, encourage China to put limits on the number of warheads it would place on its DF-41 intercontinental ballistic missiles. Would space keep out zones for Chinese spacecraft approaching US early warning satellites? What would that sort of translate to in China's give and take? Even if the bargains are impossible, I think they do get to what is truly driving sort of force requirements in those different areas. So I think the reasons, though, that I'm not confident the US is going to go down this road are threefold. I think there are three main constraints it faces. One is from political posturing in the US-China relationship that's going to make talking hard. The second is that I think the Biden administration is constrained by domestic politics in the US not to look soft on China. And finally, the US is constrained by allies who are worried that anything that could be perceived as sort of giving China an inch is coming at the expense of their security assurances. And so I think the US does also need to have some hard conversations with its allies to say that if we don't approach China and discuss kind of arms control, the future isn't the status quo. The future could actually look much worse for those countries, especially if China keeps on building up these theater nuclear capabilities for limited nuclear strikes. That means a nuclear war is not going to play out on the continental United States, but right in their territory. So I'll end with that happy thought.
Thanks again. Okay, let's turn to Hans now for his views, and then Tom.
Yeah, very good points. Very good points. So on the first part, will respond versus should respond. Well, I certainly think. I mean, we've already seen this. The Chinese. It's China, China, China. The Chinese are coming. It's coloring everything, so this will definitely continue to fuel the perception of that threat. It'll drive worst case planning in the way it always does. We've already seen initial signals from key US strategic planners, for example, Stratcom's, the Stratcom commander, Richard, he's already been on record stating that, well, I can't deal with a growing Chinese nuclear force if I can only deploy 1,550 warheads on my systems. It was intended for focusing on Russia as well as a much smaller Chinese nuclear force. So there's already a poking at the fences from that side. So it'll probably also mean that arguments that the United States should not move ahead with a sea-launched nuclear cruise missile will have a much harder time, because people who argue that that system is needed will have a greater case to make that system will somehow serve a valuable function in a growing nuclear competition with China out there in the region. You will also see drives to perhaps try to signal in other ways vis-a-vis China. We obviously see hypersonics being developed, but also think on the nuclear level, whether we will see some kind of role of dual capable fighter aircraft in a theater mission. Not the same way as we have in NATO, because there's a different alliance structure for that, but nonetheless, some kind of signaling. But other than that, I think it's, of course, mainly conventional that's going to be the military response to this. This is going to significantly drive programs that are underway, and also others. But I also just want to emphasize here that it's interesting that U.S. capabilities, certain U.S. capabilities, are a lot more potential, a lot more capable in the region today than they were 2 decades ago. And this comes back to the drivers here. One of the things is my impression that woke China up, that it needed more or better military capability, of course, was this astounding display of precision munition in the Gulf Wars that I think essentially convinced Chinese planners that they would be toast in any conventional conflict. And those conventional capabilities are important drivers, not only for China's conventional modernization, but I think also for part of its nuclear modernization. Fear of preemptive attack and these types of things is not just about nuclear attacks, it's also about conventional attacks. And so I think, yes, conventional is militarily a better response to the nuclear, but we have to keep in mind here that advanced conventional, and a lot of it, can be an important driver for deepening the sense of insecurity that is driving the Chinese developments right now. So that leads me to the should respond, how the US should respond to this. We're now seeing the Nuclear Posture Review moving through its phases, and of course it'll assess how it affects US posture planning in the region. What are the forces needed? But also, will there from that process be a need for an adjustment of presidential guidance for what targeting should be? And I think Fiona is absolutely right that Biden is under all these pressure points, all of which are pushing him in the other direction of than trying to give anything, be seen as giving anything to the Chinese. But even so, one can imagine changes or adjustment in how much damage limitation is needed for effective deterrence. Is there a point where we would, as part of that assessment, conclude that, well, we shouldn't go too far down that road because it can actually trigger a counter reaction that ends up threatening us more than what we had before? So there's a fine balance to choose there, and that's not just nuclear, but of course also in conventional systems. Missile defense, of course, absolutely, it has been a driver, but I think also what Tong accurately said, missile defense, of course, is not the only driver for this. There's a fear of insecurity. Overall, I would just like to see more of an effort to develop what you could call a grand strategy. And here I'm saying that much of the reactions and responses we see to this is either military, we need to do more of this, we need to protect the allies, or all this kind of stuff, or, well, we shouldn't, focus on that. The real important part is arms control and these other things. I would like to see sort of more of an effort to sort of integrate these things into a grand strategy that tries to bring in other elements of national power or national capacity, if you will, in a discussion and shaping a landscape in the longer term and trying to move the situation towards something that we would like to see happening, rather than something where we're just like constantly responding to it. So that'll be my pitch.
Great, thank you. Tom?
I think fundamentally because China's heightened threat perception, I believe, is caused more by political level issues, especially the ideological confrontation. We have to try to address this fundamental driver of China's overall military buildup, including nuclear buildup. Otherwise, even if otherwise it wouldn't matter if the U.S. focuses on strengthening its conventional capabilities or nuclear capabilities. Even if the U.S. focuses on conventional capability development, if American conventional superiority starts to threaten Chinese capability to achieve national unification with Taiwan, for example, China might feel pressure to heighten the role of its nuclear weapons. So it still doesn't resolve the fundamental security challenge. So in order to address that fundamental driver of this arms race, I think certain political efforts have to be made by the two sides' national leaders to try to understand and find out if they can agree on some sets of on a set of basic human universal values, right? I think that political level effort has to be made. So far, I think the Chinese approach seems to be using military modernization and nuclear buildup to force the United States drop the ideological disagreement, but I don't think that is going to work. So something fundamental is some effort to address fundamental problems are necessary. In terms of the operational level measures, again, I said I don't think missile defense is the magical button by pressing which you can stop China's nuclear buildup and resolve all the problems. The U.S. missile defense capability development has been incremental in recent years, whereas the Chinese nuclear buildup has been very much accelerated at a rate and scale that cannot be fully accounted for by U.S. missile defense development. That said, I think it's still useful for the US to offer a dialogue on missile defense, because missile defense still appears to be the biggest technical level driver of China's nuclear modernization. And by the way, I think China today is expressing more explicit interest in developing its own layered missile defense technologies and maybe capabilities. I'm not sure that China would, jump on the U.S. offer to really squeeze the United States on the issue of missile defense, because China itself now has greater interest to have the freedom to develop all sorts of missile defense technologies. So it would be useful for U.S. to simply offer a talk on missile defense, even if only to understand what's the current Chinese consideration, concerns, and possible expectations about the issue of missile defense. Given the fact that China's nuclear buildup is probably not to seek a nuclear first strike capability, but to develop escalation control capacity and to provide China with a conventional level of freedom. I think we really need to stress the importance of discussing how to manage this competition over escalation control. Because escalation control is a much more complex system than a simple deterrence based on massive retaliation. There are many ways, there are many pathways of inadvertent escalation that may not be fully appreciated by Chinese American decision makers. And those potential escalation pathways have to be understood to avoid the risk of nuclear use. And that's some point about arms control. I think maybe how to call arms control dialogue is important. I don't think arms control is a very welcome term in Beijing. So maybe to call it a dialogue on strategic stability, maybe a better approach. But the important point is, I don't think the US should be afraid to offer to talk about issues of Chinese concerns. China really wants a US commitment on mutual vulnerability or no first use. I think the US should be ready to talk about those issues first and foremost, because even on the issues of mutual vulnerability, China itself does not appear to have a clear position on its specific expectations. What specific reassurance is China seeking from the United States on mutual vulnerability? What types of concrete measures is China asking the United States to offer? I don't think China itself has thought through those concrete issues. So to have a dialogue on those could help China clarify its positions, sort out its own thinkings, and open opportunities for deeper and broader discussion on issues of mutual concern. Similarly, on the issue of no first use, there are many specific issues that China itself hasn't figured out how to make a no first use policy credible. I don't think a US offering of no first use would be immediately reassuring to China, because China itself doesn't appear to know what is reassuring. So I think it's totally okay for the US to basically accept the Chinese proposal and start a discussion on those issues of Chinese concern, which would provide a good opportunity to have a broader and long-standing discussion about all issues and technologies that could affect the bilateral nuclear relationship.
Great, thank you very much for your thoughts on that. We will now open it up to question and answer from the audience. We have quite a queue together, and there's quite a number of excellent questions. Some of them are on related themes, and so I will group some of them together where I can. In this portion of the panel, I'm just going to open the question up, ask it, and then whichever of the panelists would like to speak, just raise your hand, jump in. Some you may want to comment on, others you may not. First up, we have several questions that touch on the theme of US regional alliances in Asia and regional states' reactions to China's nuclear developments. How are other regional actors, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, thinking about Chinese nuclear developments? What are they looking for in terms of reassurance from the United States? In particular, Dr. Amy Wolf in our audience asks, what can the United States and its allies do to convince China and reassure allies that the United States will stay in the region and defend its allies if a conflict that could escalate to nuclear use begins to unfold? She points out this is not just a question of weaponry, but also alliance management. And I will just note and throw into the mix as well that Tong was just mentioning the possibility of the US offering a no first use pledge. Hans mentioned the nuclear posture review. And so, I will throw that into the mix, that if the issue we're talking about is China's nuclear modernization and some of the alarm that that's causing in the region, where does US nuclear posture fit into this? Because some would say, oh, the US should offer a no first use pledge because that'll reassure China. But of course, we know that US regional allies seem to not be particularly excited about a US no first use pledge that might be perceived as weakening the US nuclear umbrella. So please feel free to respond to any or all of those questions. I think they're all logical follow-ons from everything we've been discussing so far.
if I can jump in first, because it's about the issue of no first use. I'm not suggesting U.S. offering no first use upfront because it is impossible for the U.S. to do so. I'm simply suggesting U.S. offer to discuss the issue of no first use, right? Because there is recognition in China that the Biden administration is more open to no first use and the sole purpose, and but people's reaction is if the U.S. offers no first use, would be a trick for the United States to achieve something, to achieve some other malign intentions. So there is no immediate trust about the expected U.S. offering of no first use. I think that's the problem that China itself hasn't thought about, which means even if U.S. officially offers no first use, it wouldn't really play the role of confidence building or trust building. So the two countries still need to figure out some basic issues, like what constitutes a credible no first use. And we don't know what's the Chinese expectation on those specific issues, and a dialogue about no first use exactly to sort out those issues before the two governments can make an evaluation about the technical and the policy feasibility of making official mutual commitment on those regards.
Great comment. Can I jump in here as number two? Well, first of all, I think China's nuclear modernization is not directly about the region. It's a strategic relationship focus, I think primarily with the United States, but also, of course, partially with other countries. That's not to say that there are not elements of it that has importance for the region, of course, directly with regional systems that are being introduced. But it's my impression that the main driver is of course the relationship with both the United States, I mean in various functions, but including in what kind of vulnerability China sees itself. That said, of course, there is the theory that part of this is to create a cushion or cover for more freedom for China to operate conventionally in the region. And in that sense, of course, there's a direct link. And here there's no doubt, of course, that the US, it already is planning and putting out in the region significant forces. I just want to, one of my hobby horses is, of course, the conventional Javelin cruise missile that has gone into the force. Is an extraordinary capability compared to what it was just like what we had in the region just a decade ago. And it's been exercised to signal that reality. But there are many other elements of it. But I think I just want to say that, yes, of course, the US needs to develop some more in-depth consultation process with its allies in the region to turn over these issues and discuss them. But I think also part of that discussion, that consultation process, I think it's important that it doesn't just interact with the sort of usual old guard inside the ministries of defense in the region, but that it broadens the consultation to take in other elements, both of the national governments in the region, but foreign ministries and what have you, but also society, at large, because I think there's so many elements that are driving this. There's military, political, social, economic, what have you, that if you want to develop sort of a grand strategy for how to not only managing the direct relationship with China, but also to manage the relationship with the allies in the region, you really need to get sort of out of the old boys club, that US sends its people into classified conversations, the Department of Defense sends its people into classified conversations with the Japanese Minister of Defense, and they come home and they say, oh yeah, the Japanese are really worried and things like that. But it needs to be a broader, in my view, a broader and more proactive conversation to make the most of it, basically. So that would be my pitch.
I'll add a couple of thoughts to those that my colleagues have put on the table already. I mean, I would just step back for 1 second and note that I think that Chinese nuclear modernization is viewed from within the region, to the extent that I can tell, more through a political lens of what this means about PRC intentions and what it means about the kind of power that it is going to be within East Asia, and just confirms some of the things that allies and other states in the region have observed from its conventional and subconventional economic kind of behavior. But, I think we see a similar issue with allied responses that, we're familiar with from previous superpower nuclear competitions, which is on the one hand a concern about a diminishing US nuclear capability and what that might mean for the region, but also, and so that can lead to responses within allies like being opposed to the United States acknowledging mutual vulnerability with China, let alone something like a no first use discussion even. But on the other hand, they don't want a nuclear war to be fought in their region. And so allies need to sort of make a determination about, exactly what it is that they want in terms of the level of US nuclear protection, given the kinds of triggers for conflict within the region, which are not likely to be, perhaps with the exception of Taiwan, are over much lower stakes than something like you might have seen in Europe during the Cold War. And so my response to Amy's question about how to manage alliances is I think the United States needs to have some tricky conversations about what alternative futures look like for allies, because not engaging China in these kinds of at least attempts to manage the nuclear competition, the alternative future for that may be diminished, that this perception of diminished US nuclear capability, but it also could mean not engaging China could mean a much more robust sort of escalation control nuclear capabilities on China's part of the kind that Tong laid out. So thinking about what those alternative futures are and working back from them and thinking about the trade-offs in the kinds of capabilities that those countries really want and what they think is going to reassure them as well as to deter China is important. I would be remiss to go through this conversation without mentioning AUKUS and what that kind of a model of thinking about allied reassurance could mean. And I think this is a good example of the kind of allied cooperation for all of its non-proliferation critiques. I'm going to box those for a moment. But it has a long-term element to it in terms of the timing of the submarine capabilities coming online. But that long-term commitment also entails more short-term commitments from the United States to be stepping in for some of the capabilities requirements in the interim. There's a technology sharing element to it that goes far beyond the nuclear space. And I do think that signals a long-term commitment to stay within the region, but also to think about the gap between now and when the conventional capability might come online in the future. But then again, there are challenges with these kinds of arrangements as well, certainly with allies looking to develop their own conventional precision strike capabilities. These are things that could end up damaging PRC nuclear, regional nuclear capabilities if they're targeted at, for example, DF-26s. And so that creates a whole other sort of set of difficult questions that the United States is going to need to think through about how it would respond, for example, if a Japanese long-range strike capability was hitting a Chinese dual-use facility, because I can see, we've pointed to, I think, as Caitlin's work has suggested, some really serious inadvertent escalation risks. If the US does that, how does that situation get more complicated if it's an ally that is taking those kinds of steps?
Thank you very much. Okay, we are coming up on our last 15 minutes here, so I'm going to push our panelists to be concise where you can. There's a lot left to discuss. We have a great question from Professor Devin Haggerty, and he asks, to what extent do you think Chinese decision makers appreciate the logic of the security dilemma? To elaborate, do they appreciate that the US is likely to respond and perhaps over-respond to Chinese nuclear improvements to the extent that China's net security will perhaps decline? think this is a great question. I've wondered about this too. If any of you want to chime in, it's come up a bit, but anybody want to jump on this one?
Happy to go first. My understanding is probably no. There is very little appreciation of security dilemma. There is every understanding that China's security goals, foreign policy goals are completely legitimate and justified. China is a peace-loving country. Nothing China does can be and should be interpreted as being aggressive or offensive. In a insulated information environment where there is no internal discussion debate, that basically means there is a lack of capacity to conduct self-reflection. When only views that promote and support Chinese national narratives could be heard in this environment, and other views not heard. Over time, you do have a national mindset that genuinely believe that China is a purely peaceful and pacifist country, and China's rise is absolutely a blessing for the international community, and therefore China is justified to use every means possible to facilitate China's rise and to counter the countermeasures from the United States and other countries. I have a discussion with Chinese military experts, and they even publicly state that by DNA, China is a peaceful country, and China is different from other countries. The U.S. is just inherently hostile and aggressive and hegemonic. So I really worry that these very different domestic environments could seriously undermine the capacity to develop security dilemma appreciation, and that's making efforts to control the arms race and to promote arms control very much challenging.
Yeah, if I can add to that, I think, on the security dilemma, I hear what Tong says about the lack of the Chinese thinking on that. But a couple of other aspects to it, of course, seen from the US side, that we shouldn't forget that the US used to have a much greater nuclear advantage over China than it does today, of course. Not only has the Chinese forces go up and continue to go up, but the U.S. Has reduced over the last several decades its forces. The U.S. has even had an explicit strategy to try to phase out tactical nuclear systems and reduce the role of nuclear and improve conventional capability explicitly in an effort to try to reduce the role of nuclear weapons in a regional context. That has been an explicitly stated U.S. policy goal, and that has been reflected in the way it has done its force structure planning. And I don't think, frankly, we'll see where it goes, but it's not my sense that the U.S. has a great appetite for a grand new arms race with China in terms of significant buildup, if you will, of forces in the region. Yes, it'll adjust, and there will be changes to the posturing, and there will also be some new systems and what have you, but it's a slow process. And if you look at Congress, they're more interested in what pays defense dollars back home in their home state than necessarily sort of throwing a lot of extra money again, against this problem. So we'll see where it goes. But I just, I'm hesitant to think that there is a great appetite in the United States for sort of going all out on this one. So we'll see where it ends up.
If I could add some final thoughts onto those of my co-panelists, So to respond to this question, I think at least up until the past couple of years, China did at least appear to understand these security dilemma dynamics and thought about its nuclear forces in this in the realm of avoiding arms races and in the realm of relying upon nuclear weapons for leverage in conventional conflicts could end up worsening its security rather than making it better. So I think the question is what's changed in the past couple of years that suggests some of these views may no longer hold within Beijing. And based on Tong's sort of description of the current environment within China, I guess there are two outcomes that would mean you would, or two sort of reasons why you might ignore the security dilemma negative outcomes. One is because you underestimate the US's resolve to respond. So you think that if you build up, the US is going to say, I don't care enough to keep on building up my nuclear capabilities and engaging. The other possibility is you think the United States' behavior couldn't get much worse, so nothing that you do is actually going to affect what it does. So regardless of whether China shows restraint, the US is going to keep on building up its nuclear capabilities. So finally, I just add you can be aware of security dilemma dynamics and then ignore them. And I think we have a pretty good example of some of those when it comes to US investments in missile defense, where there were plenty of warning signs that they would make China feel insecure in the past. It's not the only reason why we are where we are right now, but I just note you can know them and ignore them.
On that happy note, I will turn to another theme in the question in the question and answer. We have several questions here actually about Chinese dual use intermediate range ballistic missiles. And we also have a good questioning about signaling. And I'm actually going to combine these because I think they're related in light of the discussion we've had so far this morning. Could you talk, please, about how you view these emerging Chinese dual capable weapons, particularly the DF-26, which apparently has this hot swapping capability of being able to rapidly switch between conventional and nuclear launches? What do you think weapons like this will mean in a crisis or a war if one emerges between the US and China? And in particular, in the context of thinking about these dual capable weapons, what do we know about how China will approach nuclear signaling in a crisis? And does Beijing have a good understanding of US signaling in crises? So interested in your thoughts on dual capable weapons, interested in your thoughts on the signaling dynamics separately, or you can address them together. I think they may be related. If you have any thoughts on those, we'd be very interested to hear them. And that'll probably be our last formal question. And then I have one last question I'll ask you guys at the end. So anyone want to jump in on signaling and dual capable? Hans, I see you nodding a little bit. No?
Yeah, I can try go first. You know, all those are great questions that should be explored in a dialogue. Right? But because of the lack of dialogue, we don't know. And Chinese officials don't talk about those issues at all. So that just highlights the need to have substantive dialogue to build mutual understanding on basic issues. According to international experts who have access to and who have read some internal Chinese military writings, including the Signs of Second Artillery Campaign and other related military writings that were published in the early or mid 2000s. That's the the most authoritative literature that appears to be available to international analysts. According to foreign experts who have read those Chinese writings, I think it is clear that China at that time, by the mid 2000s, hadn't developed deep understandings about signaling. In fact, China discussed a lot about how to conduct fake movements during a time of crisis to maximize military effectiveness. Right? They would according to international experts, China talks about have some missile forces conduct fake movements to distract US ISR capabilities to basically confuse and mislead American intelligence and ISR as much as possible. Sometimes even using technical level capabilities, trying to fire some missiles in a different direction, or to pretend to be firing missiles in order to protect the other missile units that are going to conduct the real intended military operations. Apparently, those operations to fake military mobilizations, to even pretend missile launches to confuse the enemy, would carry real risk of misunderstanding and overreaction. But those are viewed by China as useful military tactics to achieve a military objective. So I think that highlights a great need to build awareness in the future mutual dialogue.
Fiona, you want to jump in?
So I'll just jump in really quickly, try and touch on both of these points really quickly. I think the implications of the DF-26 is that you don't know what it's going to be carrying in a crisis or a conflict, unless the United States has the ability to know what is on the warhead when it is first perhaps sent out on patrols, or can identify certain support vehicles that are associated with nuclear operations rather than conventional operations. I think the difficulty with the DF-26 versus the 21 series is that the missile itself is indistinguishable in that case, and there'll obviously be a huge temptation for the US to strike that missile or to disable it because it has conventional applications that are anti-ship, that are have the ability to destroy runways and various other such things. On the other hand, the PRC knows the US might target these forces, and there is a little bit of evidence that it has been sorting some of these missiles into particular missile bases where they may not necessarily be sharing some of their base level infrastructure with China's ICBM forces, although there is one base that has both, if memory serves me correctly. I just foot stomp really quickly Tong's point about the early writings of the then PLA rocket force on signaling suggests that they didn't have a great awareness of how those signals could be misperceived. But China's nuclear modernization actually changes the capabilities that it's going to have available to signal. So having bombers, for example, is a visible way of nuclear signaling that China might think about using in the future. Having a higher level of readiness of certain kinds of road mobile forces might mean that alerting the force is no longer also going to be a signal, or might be misread as a signal if indeed it's meant just to keep the force survivable. So I think we can look at these old texts, but I think we should also expect that China's thinking about nuclear signaling will evolve, both because of a better awareness, hopefully, of these misperception questions, but also because the tools they have to signal are changing.
Yeah, all good points. Absolutely, I think up until this point, it's been focused on, ensuring that there is a capability that it will function effectively militarily, rather than influence or signaling, politically, so to speak, in that flow of events. That said, there's so much we don't know about their thinking, their strategy, of course, on the issue here. But it's been interesting to see, for example, that initially on the DF-21 force, the medium-range ballistic missile force, there were initially one or two nuclear, and then you saw conventional systems being added to that force. There were significant differences in the way they looked and operated and where they were based. So there was a way to, make a difference. There's a new version of that system that has been introduced, Mod 6. We haven't seen it, or at least I haven't seen it yet. But if you can imagine, if that looks more closely what the other conventional ones look like, then you could increase the risk of miscalculation if these forces in an operation are mixed or what have you, potentially. As for the DF-25, yes, there's been a lot of this hot swap talk out there. When it comes down to it, though, I wonder if the force is not overwhelmingly conventional and that a portion of it has a nuclear mission. It may not be sort of throughout all the brigades of this system that you will have this kind of mixed capability, but there will be a couple of them that will have that function. The point being that it could be that this hot swap capability is just a reflection of the fact that that's just a more efficient way of operating these forces instead of having two entirely different launcher systems, to do this. Whether that therefore means strategically they're mixed in the field and is another matter.
Hans, unfortunately, I've got to jump in because we are at time. Do you want to say one more sentence, or are you able to?
Only that's your prerogative. Go for it.
Okay, I hate to intervene. I hate to interrupt any of you when you're talking about China's nuclear forces. I know we could be here another 90 minutes. I've learned a lot. I want to thank everyone who attended for asking such great questions. We got to most, but not all of them. I want to thank the Walsh School of Foreign Service Asian Studies program again, and the Initiative for U.S.-China Dialogue on Global Issues here at Georgetown. Thank you to our amazing panelists, and we hope to talk more soon in the future. Thank you again for attending. That's it for today.